Preetha,
Fred.
thank you so much for chatting to me and for playing such a lovely concert. It was really fun. What are the things that you can use in different styles? What can you take from one style and apply it to another? And and this is something that really interests me. So and I worry about it a lot. The sort of delicate balance between allowing things to cross-fertilize, but also the need to kind of compartmentalize and separate things so that you don't end up sounding silly.
Well, I think a lot of styles of music outside of the Western classical repertoire have a lot of resonances, and that might be ornamentation and a kind of, there's something that's specific, but it's equally relaxed. Like there's freedom within even what's chartered and written out. And I think I noticed that tonight, even soaring through this music. Like there's definitely specifics to each style that I can play. Like I can play an Arabic song and realize that doesn't quite sound so Arabic the way I'm inflecting something, because maybe I'm not doing the ornamentation or the slide in the kind of exact way that it would be delivered by somebody who's experienced in that style. But there is a bit of give and take in the music, and compared to, not in a hierarchical way, but compared to classical music, where sometimes there's just a little bit more specificity about where things fall, and so there isn't necessarily so much freedom within what you're playing, even though you can take your liberties with tempo and certain things, but in certain expressive qualities are very precise. So I'd say for me, for a lot of styles, it can be those subtleties of like the ornamentation, but the notes themselves and what you're making can be a bit more free.
And so how do you, when you play a solo Bach piece, how does the other music influence that, or how much do you let it influence that?
Yes.
Is, I guess, the thing.
I think
because it must be very tempting to sometimes to play a slide in a way that would be appropriate for one thing, but it must be very tempting to do it in this music, and then that's quite risky in a way, isn't it?
It is. And I think at some point, like what I've taken for myself in my own journey is that these different styles have like consolidated in some way within me, and I still like, especially I think today, like performing Bach at home, I think I take a lot more liberty to explore it. Not necessarily by changing the style, though. I don't add ornaments that weren't there, but I think I take more maybe freedom. But in the context of performing it, I was like, wow, people have an expectation of what this might sound like, and the kind of vibrato that they might have heard it, and especially as a violinist, there's some expectations in a kind of a framework that we're used to following. And I realized I think I got a bit nervous because I was like, oh, this is going to be compared, not because I'm getting to charter it in my own voice, but partly because it's already has its kind of lineage that's already established what the kind of goal is for this piece. But I do think for me what's kind of cross-fertilizing is the sense of expression. Like, if you want to put your soul and heart into something, I don't think you should be dictated necessarily by the technique or what you've been told to do. At some point, the tools are definitely a part of expression, and you need the tools in order to express. But at the same time, I think to just be able to really allow a slide to happen and take your time to it, that's what I'm learning now by like going deeper. And I mean, I feel like I've only scratched the surface with Indian music. Like, it's been so nice to share it with you all in the performance that we did. But as I'm able to connect some dots, I'm realizing that actually it's not just a slide, it's the timing of a slide that creates that expression. So there are a lot of technical tools that enable expression, and what those are changes, but then you can apply it. So you can realize, okay, well, in Indian music, I have to really think about this timing. Can I do the same in a passage in Bach, but not necessarily in a metronomical way? But can I feel the slide?
Yeah. So how do you think we get to a place where that kind of freedom is allowed to exist in European classical music?
Ooh, good question.
That's a hard question.
That is hard.
Or you could tell me, if you sort of related to that, what are the things that you learned at music college, studying European classical music, that you now are not so sure about, or maybe you reject them?
Yeah. Well, as I've mentioned to you before, I think like, so as a violinist, we kind of had these goalposts to reach, and there were already like things that we needed to achieve technically in order to kind of qualify.
Yeah, yeah.
And at least in an American college at the time, it was like big sound and and to achieve that, you needed to have a certain type of bow hold, and I can't, I mean, it seems so far away, like my whole studying, so I can't fully remember everything, but I know I've taken it. Yeah. And it's been so deeply embedded into me that I still, to this day, have to work at kind of unconditioning myself.
Right, because what they think with those two things in particular, things that maybe didn't particularly resonate with you, like physically or emotionally, or could you just really take them?
I think I just took them on board and was like, okay, this is what I'm doing. It wasn't ever like, this is negative.
Yeah, we're too young to question those things, I guess, back then. Yeah.
But I think, actually, for a lot of the music I play, I seek a more delicate sound that can flow, and that doesn't mean that it doesn't have to be big, but it might require a different use of the bow and a different use of like the body that is completely different from what I was really training to do at that point in time. So that's what's interesting. It's not necessarily right or wrong.
Of course.
It just becomes this thing that I think ultimately in college, and I don't think my teachers meant it in any negative way, but we were aspiring for like to be these other voices. We were like, we had these people who I really look up to, and I'm happy that they were there, you know, like the famous violinists that we'd always listen to and be like, okay, this is what I want my sound to be. But actually that takes away in some way from you finding your own voice and being able to kind of look at a score or hear a piece of music and then think, what am I wanting to express through that?
Yeah. Okay. So these different ways of playing the violin, you just mentioned things about sound and like heaviness of sound, and you were speaking about before about ornamentation and vibrato. So what are these different ways that you play? Do you think you could show us some of those things and demonstrate like how in one style of music something is appropriate, and in another style like the same idea exists but it's actually articulated very differently?
Yeah. So if I were going to slide, I could slide faster.
Yeah. And you're sliding often with one finger, right?
Or actually I'm moving between my 1 and my 3. So on a kind of more superficial differences, the tuning's different, so the strings have less tension.
Oh yeah, that's
a big thing.
Yeah.
I think for me it feels so different, even if I tune down my Western strings to play in the more Western style. It makes a huge difference. But then in terms of your fingers and the way they're used, it almost feels like you're using your hand as a unit, and that changes from this sense of individual fingers and individual notes. It's like I realized only recently that I never could hear the changes between notes, but that's because you have a subtle, like, I'll show you what I mean. The bow and the coordination of the fingers, it's not just the slide of the finger, but you're almost foreseeing the note before it happens.
Yeah.
But it's so small that you don't even hear it. And so I always was like, how do they create that sound? How do they make that connection? Because I couldn't tell that that's what was happening. Yeah. But it's like that subtle, tiny anticipation creates a connection. Yeah. And that happens with the bow and the fingers. But it almost sounds like if you hear it sounds like the bow and the hands are kind of not in sync in the way that we hear it.
Yeah.
But that's super subtle.
Yeah, and it creates a lot of resonance as well, doesn't it?
Exactly.
So that's how you would slide between notes in this music.
I've been working recently on North Indian music, and that's a different kind of classical genre. So that has also subtle but different techniques
Yeah.
between South Indian music and North Indian music, and it also will change in the lineage and the school that you
Yeah.
study in, because ultimately you're trying to recreate the voice, I think,
Right, because
in
you're
the
always
South
shadowing
Indian genre. Yeah.
the voice, right?
But one thing is, like, I think with the nuances that we look for in classical music, in Western classical, where it's like how much, when do you use less bow, and when do you use more bow, and when do you give some accents, and how do you control, like in portamento, how do you control the slide? Those are all there.
Yeah.
I think it just comes from really imbibing it, from listening and listening and listening,
Right.
because it's an oral tradition.
Right.
So
Yeah.
to get that really slow pull, no one says it's this many seconds and you have to wait for, a beat and a half. It's, you've got to just hear it so many times that you understand it.
Yeah, whereas when you learn classical music, you sort of plan everything, don't you? You plan like the
Exactly.
distribution of the bow, you plan all your finger positions,
Yeah.
whereas in this music, because it's learned in such a different way and there's semperizing, you don't really have to plan those things, you just have to know how to do it, and then it comes out right, but it could come out differently each time.
Yes, but I think the best of both worlds is when the instrumentalist knows enough about the language from having done it so much intuitively that they can combine the kind of planning with the intuition.
Yeah.
But I guess this is all coming to me now. The planning doesn't precede the intuition.
Yeah.
The intuition's always at the heart
Yeah,
of
yeah,
it.
yeah. Nice,
And
nice. And so what about vibrato? Like, show me like the kind of vibrato you might use in this music, and then maybe show me like what the difference is
Sure.
with Western music.
With Western music, I think vibrato is a much more pronounced technique.
Yeah.
So you're gonna, when I'm in home, I'm still trying to keep up with some of my Western playing, and I would just really spend time trying to control the speed and increase it so that you have versatility and it's not just like a crutch,
Mechanical,
but it's
yeah.
something you've thought about. Whereas in Indian music, I think it's not like this ready, accessible thing that every violinist does. But when you can, you use it as a touch. And it can be, you don't, I would never want to play everything with,
Sure.
it doesn't sound right. It
Yeah.
doesn't even, that's not how you would do it. But you might land on a note plain and then add a little for like a bit of shimmer
Well,
and
it's
resonance.
interesting that, up until like really the 20th century in Western classical music, that was true as well. The
Yeah.
vibrato only became a kind of ever-present thing, relatively recently. Before it was like
Exactly.
just another ornament,
That makes complete
which is
sense.
very kind of very nice to realize actually,
Yes.
especially for string players, that you don't have to like be at it, on every single note.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's one of the things that also, I think if you've come from that tradition of adding it to everything, one of the things you have to unlearn when you
Yeah.
go into other styles is, can you really sit on a note playing? That's very hard for string players nowadays.
Yeah.
They're so used to having that be automatic that to really, and I think once you start to practice without vibrato, you start to really listen to like the exact pitch of the note and
Yeah,
all
so
of these
tell me
things. And I
about-
think,
Tell me about pitch then.
yeah, it's the same thing. I grew up, luckily I had perfect pitch,
Yeah.
but for me, that's what I thought was like kind of normal.
Yeah.
But actually, once you leave the Western system, that's not, perfect pitch is a luxury, but it exists in absolute pitch and temperate tuning. And I think, of course, people have wonderful ears across the world, and it's because they've had to listen and match
Yeah.
things. So the same thing. Something I'm still working on is being able to hear the subtlety of pitch outside of tempered tuning.
Yeah.
So I can tell even when I'm working on Indian ragas now, or that's like, raga is like the melodic framework of a piece
Yeah.
and a mode in a sense. And I can tell some things where I'll just give you an example.
Sure.
If I, it's the seventh, right?
Yeah.
But actually, it should just be a bit
should be
higher,
higher, yeah.
really close to the.
Yeah. And what kind of emotional feeling is that attached to particularly?
I think it just brings a brightness
Okay.
and like almost touching
Sure.
the tonic.
Yeah, because within like the whole the you know the big amount of sliding between notes, there are really specific pitches to land on, right? Which they're not like pitches on a piano that are equally tempered.
Yes, and I've started, like last year, I started taking lessons with a teacher again, who is brilliant. His name is Sriram Parashuram, and he's like a maestro of both North Indian and South Indian, and he's had exposure to world styles and Western classical. And for me, it was just a revelation, some of the things he pointed out, because before, of course, teachers might just allow you to have your time to figure it out. But when somebody actually is like, no, actually, that's flat.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, really? I didn't notice that. But you think the name of the note as the seventh, like I guess the equivalent in solfege, T to do, T-do. You think it's T, so you think, okay, it's the seventh, but actually it's so close to the do.
And we sort of get taught that that pitches are quite objective things. And of course, all over the world, we should realise that, you know, all music over the world, it's the pitch is anything but fixed.
Yes.
You know, and that those sort of spaces between are sometimes the most beautiful areas. Another thing that I noticed about like the difference between classical violin playing and many other styles is the thing of attack. Like especially in like kind of how can I describe it? Well, in like the most kind of hardcore romantic violin style, there's like sorry about that. There's a lot of attack sometimes. It's quite an aggressive way of like of reaching the string with your bow, and in a lot of other styles of music, string playing, that rarely happens. Like once tonight when you played, when you were playing, at one point you kind of left contact and you sort of attacked, and it was like, whoa. It was really shocking in a way, because the rest of the time you were like there, you know, and it has this like flowiness, and it makes it a lot more resonant. And like in you know folk music, violin playing, it's the same thing. People don't like come at some great height and attack the string as if it's some like, you know, fight with the instrument. It's something I really struggle with a lot of Western classical music. So is that something you can relate to?
Yeah, I've never tried to think of it in, you know, that's how it's done in Western classical, but I do know when I come back to that genre, I'm back to this like, oh yeah, it's like my default, right? Because I've been trained to kind of think of it. I do think that there's so many awesome qualities about being able to explore the gamut of your instrument. So if you think, it's not so much, if you don't think of it as an attack, it could just be like, how do you get the richest sound out of your instrument? And that might be from coming from it from different angles. And I do think when I play Indian music, I can't help but have some of those things, because I've been trained in that for so many years of my life, that I know that there's probably things I think about that are very different than somebody who's been fully trained in Indian classical music. And it could be like attack of the bow and maybe being able to give some other Western techniques to the style. But that's the fun of it, I think. It's like being able to see where you can take some of those elements, like attack, and bring them into another style.
And that's going back to the first question that we spoke about, the balance between compartmentalization and pollination.
To me, it's super subtle. It's like kind of from within. Because I'm always going to come to Indian music, I think, in world styles from a language that's it's like, you know, you're an English speaker fundamentally. So unless you've really mastered your other languages where they're all on equal terms, like for me, the Western music system is still probably predominant.
For you,
but the other ones are growing
as
I do that. And that'll take years, but it's still like, I will look at them and challenge the lens of Western music. I'll be like, oh, now I don't think and hear like this. But that's because it's taken years of kind of unconditioning this.
So what are those things that when you, that having been through this process of getting into other music, how has that affected your perception of listening to music or playing music?
Well, I think for playing wise, it's really helped me to open, like in terms of pitching, in terms of like understanding, like I had such a strong relationship to where things were on my violin based on pitch. And so just changing tuning is so fun. But it also just makes you kind of think out of the box. You're not locked into what you know. And I think that can work for any instrument, not just the violin.
Oh, definitely.
You tune it differently and you create new sounds, you create new chords, harmonies, melodies.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean there's a terrible standardization of music learning, isn't there? Like in a kind of Western classical system. And I imagine a lot of like students, you know, if they felt like they were allowed to experiment with stuff like tuning and stuff like pitch and stuff like freedom, they would probably, a lot of them would be able to find themselves a lot more, because so many, like you said, so many of them are trying to like emulate something that maybe doesn't always suit them.
Yeah. Also, I think that's the key. It's like when you're emulating, but without the sense of freedom and creativity. And I think at least what I'm discovering from exploring other styles is there's still a lot to learn, and it's very precise.
Yeah.
But there's so much freedom within the language that even the learning process is like experimenting. It might be like, oh, I'm going to have to learn to improvise. And there's a lot of building blocks to this improvisation, but there's still freedom. I think what I remember in practicing classical music is there's a point where you're looking for perfection and your technique has to be perfect, and you're kind of redoing that over and over. And I think then there might be a point where it hinders creativity and freedom. I don't know, it's a fine balance to find.
Totally.
Because I still really value that repertoire in the style.
Of course. And do you think improvisation is something that people should teach more of at music college, for example, even people studying Western classical music?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think it at least should be encouraged. So, I mean, I always feel like my improvisation in my own voice, you know, I can try to do Indian music and do the improvs in Indian music style, but when I try to do it myself, it just becomes what it is.
Sure.
And I feel very free to do that when I can just pick up my violin and play as I wish, without, I mean, having some things to follow but not being locked into anything.
Yeah.
And I think something that I've really enjoyed exploring in my London life is working with young musicians who are training, but then finding places where there are gaps in their training because they haven't had the opportunity to kind of look at their instrument in a playful way and just say, here, let's just try making something up, and there's no right and wrong, but just try. Because I've met musicians later on who are very, like, excellent players, but they're scared to look off. They're terrified to look off the page. And for me, that's a shock because I've gotten so used to not being on the page.
Yeah. Do you think there's something fundamentally different between reading music off a page and playing music without a page, even if you're playing like the exact notes that have been written by a composer or whatever?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think first you're listening in a completely different way, and I mean, I think it's completely valid to learn a piece of music from reading, but a lot of people become visually dependent and they look for the cues visually to recreate it. But when you actually just have to go by your ear and you're kind of...
So you really think fundamentally listening is different when you're reading off page?
Yes.
Okay.
But then again...
I don't know I don't know what I think about that, but
yeah.
it's
I do, because, I mean, I grew up having to memorize everything I played.
Ah, okay.
And so, I mean, it's been kind of
Yeah.
something I've done all along. And I do think all of a sudden there's not something there, so you just have to be with yourself.
Yeah.
And be with the piece of music. It's not to say that the piece of music changes that much, but all of a sudden I don't know, it's like visually not there as another thing you're having a dialogue with in that moment in time.
Yeah. And I guess that you know, that does take it closer, obviously, to improvisation.
Yes.
Because when you're improvising, obviously you're not reading anything, and when you're improvising, normally it's pretty real. As in, like, you don't have to really worry about that balance between compartmentalization or whatever, because it just comes out. All the stuff you put in kind of comes out. Okay. And what are the things that you still love to practice? That's a slightly geeky question, but actually it's quite interesting.
It's a geeky question for a geeky person.
Yeah, well, count me in for sure.
I still sit, like, I move between my Western practice. I call it Western practice partly because I'm just in a different posture. I have a different tuning.
Yeah.
I work on scales and the sound quality. And then I explore kind of recreating some of the improvs and things I picked up in other styles and the ornamentation. So one of my biggest things that I'm working on right now is to kind of look at the things that I'm gaining out of working in another tuning and fluidity So this is this melodic system. Once you're in a tonic, you're there.
Yeah.
And so everything's in relation to your open string.
Yeah.
And that's very comfortable.
Oh God, yeah.
But if you all of a sudden try to recreate the same sound, but starting on a B or like a note that's a fingered note, how do you get that? It's very different physically. So can I still achieve the same subtleties that I'm discovering in this style? Can I recreate them for a kind of harmonic system?
Yeah.
And that's an exploration. It's not always easy, and sometimes I give up in the sense I'm like, okay, well, this is why they're like this. But I'm still very curious because I'd love to be able to kind of take this modal world into a kind of harmonic world as well. So that's one of my biggest things right now. So I'm going deeper into the subtleties of the ornamentation in order to eventually bring it back to what I consider my home in my playing style.
Yeah. And so all these practices are sort of coexisting, and they're all sort of leading somewhere. Where are they leading to?
I don't know. I don't know if I'll ever reach a point.
No.
I think it's always going to keep going. But I think in some way I feel very privileged to be the holder of the torchbearer, the holder of like both of these worlds. And I know I'm still young in this other, like in my Indian musical journey, but I do feel like my understanding and kind of my experience has given me the opportunity to really kind of go deep in violin and technique and all these very subtle ornamentation and cross-fertilization, and I just feel like that's where I'm going, but also finding it in a way that becomes my own identity and my own voice.
So speaking of identity, so you grew up in Memphis.
Yes.
Home of the blues.
Yes.
and then he lived in India after university.
Yeah.
And then he moved to London. So how would you describe that identity in musical terms?
In musical terms, well, you know,
or in any terms you like.
No, I think they're like the musical journey. I mean, I've been in music my entire life, so it's always like been along for the ride. Well, you know, I think when you're growing up, so much of your musical identity is because of your family environment.
Yeah.
And so I was still learning classical music, but coming home to a family that appreciated all kinds of styles.
Okay.
So we had lots of different music on. Or my parents, I wouldn't say, they're far from Western classical being their go-to listening.
Yeah.
But they made a lot of effort to take me and my brother to concerts and, you know, expose us to orchestra, even within Memphis, which, you know, it's a city, it's blues, it's jazz and all of this stuff, but they still have an orchestra, they still have a symphony and all of that. It's still a good-sized city to have.
So what
those
was
things.
their go-to listening then?
Their go-to listening would be like a mix of Indian classical music and like the Beatles and Simon and Garfunkel and Michael Jackson and stuff like that.
Nice.
I mean, those are the names I probably always drop, but that's kind
cool,
of what we were listening to at home.
So you were listening to like Indian classical music
And like chanting, like
Yeah.
my mom's very spiritual, so she would have chanting on, and then there'd be like South Indian classical music and Hindi, like I guess it's Bollywood songs, but the old school Bollywood, like 60s Hindi
I love
songs.
this stuff so much.
So this is the stuff, like my dad would drive me to school and we'd have that, and then we'd have like Natalie and Nat King Cole, and it was just a real mix.
Okay. But
because that's what they loved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you had all these things at home, but then you were studying like quite traditionally.
Yeah, traditionally, but not in a hardcore way, in the sense like you're going down the classical path and you've got to practice like 8 hours a day. For me, it was like I loved being with other kids who played music, and we had a youth symphony. So for me, it was like, great, I'm going to practice because I want to get better and get better. And then one day when I had the opportunity to go to college, I was like, yeah, I'm going to do music. I was inspired by my teachers who were really nice, and they were like second mothers to me, and they challenged me, but they weren't dogmatic by any means. They kind of embraced me for our culture and our family as well.
Okay.
But then,
so was Memphis a not especially diverse place?
Yeah,
Would you say?
I
Was
would
it a very
say.
white place?
I mean, it's definitely, I would say white and black.
Yeah.
But it's still divided to this day. I mean,
Yeah.
it has a lot of impacts from like what was going on in slavery and in the, like all of that era.
Yeah.
So it still to this day has that kind of, you can sense the divide.
Really?
And of
Okay.
course it's changing, but change takes a very long time to happen.
Definitely, yeah.
And then as somebody who was in orchestra playing these kind of instruments, it was predominantly white or maybe some Indian, Asian people.
Yeah.
And a fair number, I'd say. I mean, not so many Indians, and there were like the immigrant population.
Yeah.
And then a very handful of African Americans.
Yeah.
So, and generally, and that's how school was. It was very divided.
Yeah.
And
so did that have an effect on how you felt about playing that kind of music? The fact that
I don't think I was aware of it
Okay.
at that age.
Yeah.
I was really just there and appreciating it and doing what I did, going to school, just playing music. It was only after I moved to India and I was around other young Indians who had been brought up in other places in the States, like California, which had large Indian populations that really, like, even as a young person, they'd been studying Indian arts and Indian music. That, for me, like, we didn't have so much in Memphis like
Yeah.
that. So for me, when I went to India, and I was always all of a sudden with this expat community, but they were Indians from the States, but they were so proud of their origin.
Yeah.
And they'd been studying, and they spoke their languages fluently, and they played Indian music and did dance, and I was like, it opened my eyes to this whole other world. And when I came back to Memphis, which I never lived there again, but when I came back to the States, I was just aware. I
Yeah.
was made aware. And I actually never lived in the States again because I went home and then I moved to London quite soon after that.
But it wasn't.
But
You didn't not live there again for any reason related to this.
No, it
you
was
just came to London.
Yeah,
to
it was just
to do a
because of
master's, right?
opportunities I'd had
Yeah.
that brought me here. But when I started to notice it, when I came back to the States, I was like, wow, I'm a minority
Yeah,
in
yeah.
this style of music. And that doesn't mean, it was just an observation.
Yeah,
It
sure.
didn't have to mean anything at that point, but I noticed it. And it seems so superficial to notice things like, oh, my skin color's different from other people. But you start to notice. And then you start to question and wonder what that means.
And when you moved to London, what happened?
I think London for me was, it still is. It's this amazing city
Yeah.
that I hope remains like this, with this immense diversity, culturally, musically, everything. And all of a sudden, growing up, I did feel like I was a bit compartmentalized in my identity. Like, because we didn't have a large Indian population, it was still sizable, but, we went to schools, we were still, it felt separated. And I think here, I just felt like all of a sudden I was getting to grow into this person that was just the sum of all these experiences.
Ah, beautiful.
And
yeah.
and that was because there was such a large South Asian music and arts community here. But then everything. You
Yeah.
go down one street and you're going to find like
Yeah.
everything for the most part, like in certain parts, And musically, hearing people like Kajali
Yeah.
and even then seeing you and Jamie Doe and that whole crew. It's just so many contrasts of musical styles just everywhere. And that was inspiring because it just meant, I think it felt more progressive and open to what music could be, but also what you could be as a person, which
Yeah.
I really appreciated.
Beautiful. Okay. Well, is there anything else you want to chat about, or?
I think you've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, that's
I hope
been
I've
lots.
made it
Yeah.
cohesive in any.
Yeah, definitely.
way.
Well, thank you so much. Learned so much just in one day from hanging out with you.
Oh, it's so
and,
nice.
So
It's been really great. One day we'll give you a hug.
yeah. Yeah, distance hug. All right, Preetha, thank you.
Thank you, Fred.